Harlem, New York. This wasn't a neighborhood struggling to survive. It was a neighborhood making too much money. Millions of dollars moved through these streets every year. But the people making the money didn't control the guns. Before Harlem had a Godfather, it had a problem no one wanted to name. Harlem did not begin as a legend. It began as a problem. In the early 1930s, Harlem was alive in ways few neighborhoods in America were. Music spilled out of open windows. Churches filled every Sunday. Streets stayed crowded long after midnight. But beneath the sound and movement, something else traveled quietly through the neighborhood. Cash. Every morning, men walked block to block with small notebooks tucked inside their coats. Nickels, dimes, quarters, hope written in pencil. By nightfall, stacks of money had been counted, wrapped, and passed along. And sometimes, men didn't come home. No sirens, no headlines, no explanations. In Harlem, people learned quickly which questions not to ask, because the money never stayed where it was made, and the people who took it didn't live there. Before Harlem had a Godfather of its own, it had a problem, and that problem didn't knock. It didn't negotiate. It carried a gun. Harlem wasn't poor because it lacked money. It was poor because the money never stayed. The numbers racket was the quiet engine behind everything, an illegal neighborhood lottery that ran on small bets and big belief. Almost everyone played. Factory workers on the way to their shift. Porters coming home late at night. Women slipping folded bills into envelopes after church, whispering numbers they hoped would change everything. Most never won much. But they kept playing. Not because they were reckless, but because the alternative was worse. The numbers offered a thin line of hope in a city that gave very few. Every day, the process repeated itself. Runners walked the streets collecting bets. Clerks recorded them carefully. Bankers held the cash and paid the winners. It was organized. It was disciplined. And it was entirely local. The money came from Harlem, moved through Harlem, and, at least at first, stayed in Harlem. It paid rent. It bought groceries. It kept lights on when factory hours were cut and jobs disappeared. For many families, the numbers weren't a vice. They were a lifeline. But money has gravity. And once the numbers grew large enough, they pulled attention from the outside. Millions of dollars were passing through a few square miles of city blocks every year. That kind of cash doesn't stay invisible for long. It attracts people who don't care where it comes from, only where it goes. Harlem had the system. Harlem had the discipline. Harlem had the trust of its own people. What Harlem didn't have was protection. Because protection requires more than money. It requires the ability to enforce rules, to punish violations, to make threats real. And in New York City, enforcement belonged to those who controlled violence, not those who counted cash. The imbalance was subtle at first. Outsiders didn't arrive with gunfire. They arrived with questions, with offers, with suggestions about partnerships and security. But everyone understood what those words meant. Pay us or someone else will. The numbers racket made Harlem valuable, but it also made Harlem exposed. The more money flowed, the clearer the truth became. Running the economy wasn't the same as controlling it. Harlem could create wealth, but it couldn't defend it. And in the world of organized crime, that distinction meant everything. Money creates opportunity. Violence creates authority. In Harlem, those two forces lived in separate hands. The neighborhood controlled the cash. Black runners collected it. Black clerks counted it. Black bankers held it. Every dollar moved through familiar faces, familiar blocks, familiar routines. It was an economy built on trust, not contracts. But when disputes happened, trust wasn't enough. Because disputes don't get settled by ledgers. They get settled by force. And force belonged to men who didn't live in Harlem. They came from downtown Manhattan, from Brooklyn, from neighborhoods where Harlem was nothing more than a place to extract value. They didn't need permission. They didn't need approval. They arrived with guns and left with envelopes. The police understood this balance better than anyone. They knew who controlled the streets and who didn't. Enforcement followed power, not legality. When violence came from the outside, it was often ignored. When it came from inside Harlem, it was punished quickly. That was the unspoken rule. Black money was tolerated. Black power was not. As long as the numbers racket stayed profitable but defenseless, it was allowed to exist. The moment it threatened established power, pressure followed. Raids increased. Arrests multiplied. Warnings were delivered quietly and often. Harlem learned this lesson repeatedly. Money without muscle invited interference. Wealth without enforcement invited takeover. Every dollar earned became a signal flare, drawing attention from men who specialized in control. This imbalance shaped everything that followed. It explained why outsiders could make demands without consequence, why threats carried weight, why violence, when it came, always seemed to favor the same side. In New York City, the future belonged to whoever could make their rules stick. And Harlem, despite all its money, could not. Not yet. Dutch Schultz didn't come to Harlem to understand it. He came to take it. To Schultz, Harlem wasn't a community. It wasn't a culture. It was a balance sheet, a place where millions of dollars moved every year without anyone strong enough to claim them. And in Schultz's world, unclaimed money didn't stay unclaimed for long. He didn't arrive with speeches or promises. He arrived with enforcers, men who carried themselves like they already owned the streets they were walking on, men who didn't ask questions and didn't wait for answers. Schultz's strategy was simple and brutally effective. First came intimidation, then came violence, then came control. Numbers runners were followed. Bankers were pressured. Messages were delivered in alleys and back rooms where witnesses didn't exist. The lesson was always the same. Harlem could keep running its numbers, but the profits now answered to someone else. Schultz didn't negotiate because he didn't believe negotiation was necessary. He believed force solved problems faster. And for a time, he was right. People paid because refusing meant consequences. Broken bones, burned businesses, names crossed off ledgers forever. Fear did the work that contracts never could. What made Schultz dangerous wasn't just his violence, it was his indifference. He didn't hate Harlem, he didn't fear it. He simply didn't care what happened after the money was collected. To him, Harlem was an operation, and operations could be optimized. The police knew Schultz's name, so did prosecutors. But Schultz understood something most people didn't. Enforcement followed power. As long as he kept the money flowing and the chaos contained, the pressure stayed manageable. For Harlem, that reality was suffocating. The numbers racket still existed, but it no longer belonged to the neighborhood. The money moved upward, outward, away from the people who made it. Harlem generated wealth, but it no longer benefited from it. And worst of all, no one could openly challenge Schultz without inviting retaliation. Harlem had money. Schultz had muscle. And muscle, in New York City, decided who stayed in control. But power built on fear has a weakness. It assumes fear is permanent, and it ignores what happens when fear turns into resolve. Harlem didn't lack strong men. It lacked someone willing to stand in the open. For years, the neighborhood lived in a strange, in-between state. The numbers racket kept running, money kept moving, life continued. But everyone understood the truth. Harlem had no one who could say no and make it stick. People adapted instead. Runners learned which streets to avoid. Bankers learned when to stay quiet. Families learned how to survive without drawing attention. Silence became a skill. Looking the other way became routine. Harlem wasn't leaderless because no one was capable. It was leaderless because leadership came with a price few were willing to pay. Anyone who pushed back too hard attracted attention. Anyone who organized openly became a target. Violence didn't need to be constant. It only needed to be precise enough to discourage resistance. Fear did the rest. So Harlem waited. It waited for someone who wouldn't rush, someone who wouldn't announce himself, someone who understood that control wasn't taken all at once. It was built, quietly, piece by piece. The community didn't want speeches. It didn't want symbolism. It wanted predictability. It wanted rules that didn't change every time an outsider showed up with a gun. What Harlem needed wasn't a hero. It needed order. But order requires enforcement. And enforcement requires a kind of resolve that most people never have to test. The willingness to stand still when a line is crossed. The willingness to accept consequences before they arrive. For a long time, no one stepped forward. Not because they were weak, because they were human. They had families, jobs, neighbors, lives they were trying to protect. Challenging men like Dutch Schultz didn't just risk your own safety, it risked everyone connected to you. So the neighborhood endured, and endurance slowly turned into something else. Because when chaos lasts long enough, it reshapes expectations. People stop asking for peace. They stop hoping things will improve on their own. They begin looking for someone who can impose structure, even if that structure comes at a cost. By the early 1930s, Harlem was ready for that cost. It just didn't know who would be willing to pay it. Ellsworth Johnson didn't arrive in Harlem. He surfaced. There were no announcements, no public moves, no visible challenge to the men already taking money out of the neighborhood. But small changes began to ripple outward, subtle enough that outsiders missed them. The violence slowed, not dramatically, not overnight, but enough that people noticed the difference. Runners who once vanished without explanation started coming home again. Collections became predictable. The streets felt less volatile, less random. No one said why, but everyone paid attention. Ellsworth Johnson didn't seek visibility. He didn't put his name on operations. He didn't demand loyalty. What he did instead was observe. He listened longer than he spoke. He learned who could be trusted and who couldn't. He paid attention to patterns others dismissed as coincidence. That patience mattered. Johnson understood something essential about Harlem. Control didn't come from dominating everyone at once. It came from knowing where pressure mattered most and where silence could do the work for you. People began adjusting their behavior without being told to. Outsiders stopped lingering. Messages were delivered indirectly. Boundaries appeared where none had existed before. Harlem didn't suddenly become safe. It became coherent. And coherence, in a place shaped by uncertainty, was powerful. Those closest to the numbers racket felt the shift first. Bankers noticed collections going uninterrupted. Runners noticed fewer confrontations. Problems that once escalated now disappeared quietly. Johnson wasn't eliminating chaos. He was containing it. And that difference mattered more than anyone realized at the time. His name moved carefully, from corner to corner, from back room to back room, never loud enough to invite challenge, never quiet enough to be ignored. Ellsworth Johnson wasn't feared, not yet. He was respected, and respect, in Harlem, traveled faster than fear ever could. But respect alone couldn't hold forever. The forces pressing in from outside the neighborhood hadn't disappeared. They were watching, measuring, waiting. Ellsworth Johnson knew that silence would eventually invite confrontation, and when that moment came, observation would no longer be enough. Nothing had been resolved. That was the part outsiders never understood. The streets were quieter, yes. Collections moved more smoothly. Violence no longer felt random. But Harlem wasn't at peace. It was holding its breath. Dutch Schultz was still alive. The Italian mobs were still watching, and the money was still flowing. Silence didn't mean safety. It meant calculation. Everyone involved understood the arrangement without ever naming it. Harlem would continue to generate money. Outsiders would continue to take interest, and Ellsworth Johnson would continue doing what he did best, keeping things contained, controlled, and quiet. For now. But order without recognition is fragile. It depends on everyone agreeing not to test it. And in the world of organized crime, someone always tests the limits. The men pressing in from outside Harlem were patient, but they were not blind. They noticed the shift. They felt resistance where none had existed before. Collections were cleaner. Threats carried less weight. Certain doors no longer opened as easily. Something had changed. They didn't yet know who was responsible, but they knew Harlem was no longer as exposed as it once was. That made the situation dangerous, because power never tolerates ambiguity for long. As long as Ellsworth Johnson remained unofficial, unnamed, unacknowledged, he could operate in the margins. But the moment his influence became impossible to ignore, a decision would have to be made. Either Harlem would accept outside control again, or someone would have to enforce boundaries openly. That was the line everyone saw coming. The community felt it first. Conversations changed. Eyes lingered longer. People began preparing without admitting they were preparing, because they knew what came next wasn't negotiation. It was confrontation. Ellsworth Johnson understood that silence had bought time, not resolution. He knew the pause wouldn't last. The forces that had shaped Harlem for years wouldn't retreat simply because things felt different. They would push back. And when they did, neutrality would no longer be an option. The next step would require clarity. It would require commitment. And it would require an action strong enough to redefine who held authority in Harlem. Ellsworth Johnson hadn't crossed that line yet, but everyone knew he was standing right in front of it. There is a moment in every power struggle when silence stops being protection. In Harlem, that moment was approaching fast. The neighborhood could feel it. The pauses between confrontations grew shorter. The looks from outsiders lingered longer. Questions were asked in places where questions had never been asked before. The quiet that once felt like control now felt like pressure. Ellsworth Johnson understood what that meant. He had spent years observing, containing, preventing chaos without announcing himself. He had learned how far patience could go. But patience by itself does not create authority. At some point, restraint stops being strength and starts being weakness. And weakness invites challenge. Harlem didn't choose Ellsworth Johnson because he was the smartest man in the room. Intelligence alone had never protected the neighborhood. Strategy alone had never stopped a gun. What Harlem was looking for now was certainty. Someone willing to make the rules unmistakably clear. Someone willing to accept consequences before they arrived. Someone willing to do the one thing that would force every other player to recalibrate. Violence was not the goal. Clarity was. Ellsworth Johnson knew exactly where the line was. He knew crossing it would change everything. How he was seen, how he was treated, how the neighborhood would respond. There would be no returning to anonymity afterward. No more operating in the margins. Once crossed, the line would redefine him. Harlem understood this instinctively. It didn't cheer for him. It didn't celebrate what was coming. It watched quietly, the way people do when they know something irreversible is about to happen. Because the next step wouldn't be about money. It wouldn't be about reputation. It would be about proving that Harlem could enforce its own boundaries. That someone inside the neighborhood was willing to do what outsiders had been doing for years, only this time on Harlem's terms. Ellsworth Johnson hadn't taken that step yet, but the choice was no longer abstract, and Harlem didn't choose Bumpy for his intelligence. It chose him for what he was willing to do next. Harlem didn't celebrate. It didn't cheer. Because everyone understood what came next wouldn't be symbolic. It would be permanent. The next move wouldn't just change one man. It would redefine Harlem itself. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back.